So what do lipstick sales, men's underwear sales, and pawn shop inventories all have in common? They all tend to provide indications for an upcoming recession. So since you love these videos so much, please put your thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and we'll get right into it and what all this entails. So let's go through this and kind of explain how this all comes about. Now, Leonard Lauder, who was the chairman of Estee Lauder a while back, first coined the term the lipstick index in 2001. And heading into that recession at the beginning of the 2000s after the dot-com bust, he noted that there was a lot more lipstick sales than what they had anticipated. And so what tends to happen in recessions is that the ladies don't buy as much of the big ticket items, but they still want to feel good, and so they buy lipstick instead. And so they first saw this back in the Great Depression in the 1920s, and they saw this in the early 2000s, they saw this in the Great Financial Crisis, but for some reason it didn't happen during the pandemic. It must be that people couldn't see everybody's lips because they were all wearing these masks. So it didn't happen during the pandemic, but we have noted here recently that Sephora has put out all-time highs in lipstick sales here recently, and there's some other groups that are noting that lipstick sales are starting to push up. One thing that we note is that housing tends to turn down first when we start heading into a recession. Also, transports don't do quite as well, trucking companies, rail companies, stuff like that. And then new orders start to slow, and then profit starts to come down. And then lastly, the last thing that tend to go bad during a recession is unemployment. And so what we noted is that unemployment bottomed in April of 2023, and it's been going up ever since then. Recently it was about 4.3% after a bottom at 3.4% last year. So we have to be wary of the unemployment, but typically during a recessionary period, we see a period where there's inflation, and the Fed tries to curb the inflation, so they hike up interest rates. And then lately they hiked it up, or the last couple of years they hiked it up pretty aggressively. And then we start to see rising unemployment. We start to see tightening lending standards. When these are all present, we tend to have a pretty nasty recession. Sometimes it happens right away. Sometimes it doesn't happen right away. Lately, we've had a lot of fiscal stimulus that have kept this recession at bay. But when we're no longer seeing that much government spending, we may see the recession come about, kind of like what we saw after 2006. So we can also note that we may be heading into a recession by looking at what's happening with the pawn shops. The pawn shops tend to take in a lot of inventory during recessionary periods. They don't sell quite as much, but they bring in a lot of things that people are trying to pawn off. And they also have a lot of loans that they put out during recessionary periods. So those are two things you might want to look at, is what are the inventories of the pawn shops and how much lending they're doing. So those are things we want to watch for. We also want to look at men's underwear sales. So during a recessionary period, the men like to hide what's going wrong with them. Men tend to hide the fact that they're not doing as well, and that shows up in their underwear. So with men's underwear, we see that they don't buy as much underwear. And Alan Greenspan actually noted this in 2008. He endorsed the underwear index, or the men's underwear index, heading into 2008 and the Great Financial Crisis. And he started cutting rates because he noted that people weren't buying a lot of underwear at the time. The main things that we look at are things like the yield curve and what the Fed is doing. Now, when the Fed starts cutting rates, that's usually a sign that they're worried about a recession. They want to head that off. On September 18th, about a month ago, the Fed cut by 50 basis points. That's a larger cut than they usually make. Usually it's like a 25 basis point cut, but this time it was 50 basis points. And so that means that they're a little concerned. And usually by the time the Fed is cutting rates, usually the market's already topped. On average, it tops about 60 days before the Fed cuts rates. In 2007, the market topped about a month after the Fed started cutting rates. In 2019, it was a few months later. But usually the market's already topped before the Fed starts cutting rates. And with the market hitting new highs, we don't know if it's a high right now, but likely with the Fed cutting rates, we're closer to the high than we may think. The Fed usually starts printing money at some point when things get bad enough. The Fed hasn't started printing money yet, so we haven't seen a lot of that. But what we have seen is there's been a lot of money printing in China. So China is actively stimulating their economy. A lot of people may note a few weeks back that China put out some massive stimulus measures. They said that they brought out a bazooka to stimulate the economy. It really hasn't done much for their economy yet, but it has helped stimulate their markets. It's helped stimulate gold. It's helped stimulate cryptocurrencies. It looks like it's actually helped stimulate the U.S. even. And so what China's done really hasn't kicked in China because their consumers are not very confident. They're not feeling good about what's happening in China, but it looks like it's having some effects elsewhere. We also note that jobs do not do as well going into a recession. Job openings are coming down. We can see that the job openings have been coming down here, but the market is still going up. This has happened before. Usually it starts going down before the market starts going down. There was a big diversion here in 2019, and we're seeing this now in 2024. And that doesn't usually happen for too long, but it can last for a little bit. We are also seeing that a lot of foreign-born workers right now are getting more of the jobs than the native-born workers. And a lot of the jobs that are out there are part-time jobs, and that's not necessarily a good sign that there's more part-time jobs out there than full-time jobs. And the main thing that we like to look at heading into a recession is the yield curve. When the yield curve starts getting back to normal, that's when the recession's already here typically. And you can see here during these mini periods, down here is where the yield curve is normal. Here's where it's inverted. When it starts getting back to normal is when the recession typically hits. And so we're starting to see this now. We can see on this next slide, this shows the 10-year yield of treasuries and the 2-year yield. You can see when the red pops up above the green, that's a sign the recession's coming. When the red comes back below the green, that's usually a sign that recession's here. And so you can see this in 2001. You can see this in 2007. You can see this in 2020, and you can see this about a month ago. And so that's a pretty nasty sign that the recession is pretty much here. This is a little bit of a closer view of the last couple of years. You can see where the 2-year yield has now kicked down below the 10-year yield. The yield curves look pretty similar right now to a period here in August of 2007. This here is August of 2007. You can see that the 10-year yield is above the 2-year, but not above the 1-year yet. That is exactly what's happening now. We've got the 10-year yield above the 2-year, but not above the 1-year yet. What happened here is it got back to normal in a pretty quick period, and it may happen this way again. This time, we don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but it looks like we're pretty close to the end of this period before the recession hits. So if you don't want to look at the industry research reports or the government reports, just talk to your friends about their employment situation. Talk to your family and find out who's getting laid off, who's hiring, what have you. If nobody's hiring, that's not a good sign. If you go to the cosmetic store and you notice they're selling tons of lipstick, that's not a good sign. If you go to the men's clothing store and see they've got a lot of underwear on the shelves, underwear sales are down, that's not a good sign. If you go to the pawn shop and you see lots of people are pawning things off, if you're having to pawn things off, if lots of people are borrowing from the pawn shops, that is not a good sign. So since you love these videos so much, put your thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share with your friends. As always, stay thirsty for knowledge, and that's all we have for today.